Welcome to Live Players, where political scientists and strategists Samo, Burja, and I discuss the key individuals with the power to alter our current society. Every week, we provide analysis of the news and case studies of live players as well as key institutions and technologies that make up the global power landscape. Let's dive in.
Hey, Erik.
Hey, Samo, how you doing? The most recent episode was on the EU, and that did very well. We talked about sort of the EU vision for the continent. And now we want to go a bit deeper into Eastern Europe. Why don't you take us away?
Well, in the early 2000s, there was this coining of old Europe versus new Europe. And this was mostly rhetorically to make a distinction between Eastern Europe that supported the United States in its foreign policy versus France and Germany that were not supporting U.S. foreign policy. Ultimately, in the long run, it turned out that maybe old Europe was wiser to be skeptical of, say, the Iraq War specifically. However, the coining points to a real political difference between East and West. Today, it exists as well. Eastern Europe is much more concerned about Russia. At the end of the day, for Estonia, possibly for Poland, Russia represents a present security risk, especially with Estonia that has a significant Russian minority. Meanwhile, for France or Germany, in the grand scale of global geopolitics, sure, it matters whether Russia, is successful in Ukraine or not. But for their security, it is essentially irrelevant, right? It is both physically farther away, and there is no real direct conflict of just a national interest kind. The political difference is just the first angle, though. There's a deeper cultural divide. You can look at almost any map of European regulation. Consider a map on supporting nuclear energy, and there was a proposal for nuclear energy to be counted as a form of sustainable or green energy, which, in my opinion, it is. It certainly contributes to reduction of CO2 emissions. If something like the net zero targets that these countries have set for the 2030s or 2040s, if those targets are to be met, it is almost certain that baseload power will be required. Which countries voted against nuclear energy? Well, basically Germany, Central Austria, the Netherlands, Switzerland. Which countries voted for? Well, it was Eastern Europe, almost as a bloc, plus France. And we can go through on agricultural policy, on labor laws, on digital privacy, on immigration. Famously, there was a disagreement between the Visegrad Group, which is a grouping of countries that includes Poland, the Czech Republic, so Czechia, Slovakia, and Hungary, and Germany, again, on immigration policy, where the question was how many refugees should be accepted, where should they be resettled, and so on. The immigration politics have changed from a few years ago. I would characterize Eastern Europe as skeptical of mass Islamic immigration, but at this point, actually under center-right governments, they've opened up to immigration from the Philippines, from Vietnam, from various other places. So if I were to characterize it, I would say that the small business owner structure of some of these countries is actually favorable to a lot of legal economic immigration, but culturally, religiously, they feel very uncomfortable with having large Muslim minorities that, as we now see, countries like France and Britain have struggled to truly integrate. And for Germany itself, the refugee wave, which at the time was coming mostly from Syria, has been an economic disaster. And again, to point to another refugee wave, so let me explain what I mean by economic disaster. They did several studies where it was noted that, 5 years on, over 80 or 85% of them were unemployed and on welfare. So at the very least, a complete failure of Germany to equip these new arrivals to society and acculturate them and, employ them. So a net drain on the German taxpayer and therefore on the European taxpayer in general, probably as well. But for Eastern Europe, for example, there was an acceptance of a large refugee wave. I think because of the anti-Russian politics, places like Poland, accepted like 500,000 Ukrainians. Germany, to be fair, also accepted a lot of Ukrainians. And that seems to have worked out better for them. Now, we could have an entire episode, maybe we should actually, on the consequences of a world of mass migration to countries that don't have a history of assimilation like that the United States has. But I'll leave that for a future episode. I'm just sketching out the very fundamental differences in political phenomena between West and East. And finally, I think Eastern Europe is the only part of Europe, in addition to the Nordic countries, so Scandinavia and Denmark and Norway, that shows strong economic growth and has shown strong economic growth for the last 20 years. It is true that the growth is shown from a very low baseline. And it is true that even in Eastern Europe, there is a north-south division. Countries such as Estonia and Slovenia are now essentially in the EU average when it comes to GDP per capita, right? They are poorer than places like Germany, but they are already much richer than places like Portugal, that has been an EU member for decades, or Greece, again, an EU member for a very long time. The growth also has resulted in a kind of catch-up. Living standards in Slovenia, Poland, Estonia have been improving steadily for 20 years. The story is less optimistic for southern Eastern Europe. So we could actually make a division here between what people call Eastern Europe and the Balkans. The majority of the Balkans, which you could classify, say, even Slovenia as part of, and almost everyone classifies Croatia as part of, they've actually not seen very good growth, like Serbia, Montenegro, Northern Macedonia, Bulgaria, Romania, Bosnia. Now, if we go by population, about half of the Balkans is now inside the EU. Examples include, places like Croatia. But they have been economically stagnant and have experienced a disastrous demographic draw, where something like 20-30% of working adults in countries that already have low fertility have gone west to Western Europe. But even that story is interesting. And even that story indicates that in some ways, it wasn't Western Europe that bailed out Eastern Europe and is supporting Eastern Europe over the last 20 years. If we count Eastern Europe to include Poland, the Baltic states, and these Balkan countries I described, even Poland has had significant emigration. Now it has people returning from cities like London to a certain extent to participate in the booming economy of Polish cities such as Warsaw, right? So there's like a return trend in at least Poland to a certain extent, and emigration has tapered off and has now become an immigration destination, as I said, for people from the Philippines, people from Vietnam, and also, of course, people from Ukraine, and ever more also people from Bulgaria and Romania. The story we can say is that it's not Western Europe that has bailed out Eastern Europe and is subsidizing it. I would say that Eastern Europe is bailing out and subsidizing Western Europe. Consider, for example, the demographic numbers of Western Europe. How do you get a TFR? Well, you count the number of babies born in a hospital, and you count the number of people in the country, and you come up with a figure that's kind of a ratio. Okay, what's the total fertility rate? And we've recorded all of these births pretty accurately. In Eastern Europe, this figure is probably underestimating fertility. Why? Because there's a political incentive to lie about how many people are still living there. If you had an accurate census in, say, Croatia or Romania, that would be politically disastrous. You would have to admit that over the last 10 or 20 years of your government, something like a third or half of all young people have left. So you have a fictional number of young people who legally have their home and residency registered in the country of origin, and you count the number of babies in the country plus these legally fictitious people, and then you get a TFR that used to be completely disastrous at 1.1 and sort of rebounded to the 1.4, 1.5 range. That's a low TFR. But if you accounted for how many of the Eastern Europeans are actually now, giving birth in French hospitals or British hospitals or German hospitals because they actually live there, even if their registered residency is not in Eastern Europe, well, I think then maybe actually Western Europe might have lower fertility than Eastern Europeans, if we count Eastern Europeans as a category. And even Eastern Europe itself, if you counted only the real people living there, they're probably way older. The average age is probably way higher than currently is presented. But the young people that are there, they might actually have a TFR closer to 1.7, 1.8. And when you look at the statistics for Eastern European immigration into Western Europe, it almost always is the case that the economic contribution to the society is higher than the welfare draw. So, in other words, some of the GDP growth of Germany and France, well, it's GDP growth that would be lower if the Eastern Europeans had not come in those great numbers. Certainly true of London, for example, even though London, of course, now is no longer an EU city. So we have a demographic subsidy of Eastern Europe to Western Europe, and we have a regulatory arbitrage where Eastern Europe tends to have much less regulation on manufacturing. Also, surprisingly low taxes. Now, for the EU, low taxes is nothing to write home about. These are still very high taxes, but countries sometimes will not have any capital gains taxes. And a lot of these countries in the aftermath of communism, trying to move as far in the other direction as humanly possible, instituted a flat tax, something that is only discussed and debated in the United States. So a flat tax is, you pay 20% or you pay 50%, and it doesn't matter what your income category is, you all pay the same. It is basically the abolition of so-called progressive taxation. In progressive taxation, the more you have, the higher proportion you also pay. So in a way, it's this upward curve, and instead it's a flat one, right, across the tax categories. So all of this said, Germany has migrated a lot of its manufacturing into Eastern Europe. They built manufacturing of various car components, various metallurgical operations, even at times pharmaceutical research labs, right? They found their way into places like Slovenia and so on. You have German-owned businesses arbitraging lower labor cost, yet high skill. So high skill offshoring happened to a great degree within the EU. So that's another subsidy that, again, will mostly show up in German GDP figures rather than, say, Polish GDP figures. So in a very real way, Western Europe is wealthier, and Eastern Europe has provided Western Europe with a lifeline in terms of being able to claim growth for the EU as a whole, economic growth, and also masking aspects of Western European demographic decline. I think in the long run, maybe Eastern Europe would have been better had they not entered the Schengen area, because I think these countries are on a global level still too poor to truly compete on immigration once the global demographic transition is completed. There will be a point where the US will still attract immigrants, and I'm sure there will be immigrants still going to Germany or eventually to Japan. That seems to be opening up. But will Poland ever truly be a desirable destination? Well, that's a question, right? You might, as long as there are people who want to go to their fifth favorite country, I'm sure Poland will find its workers. But if there are only enough migrants in the entire world to go to their favorite or second favorite or third favorite country, then this region might experience significant labor shortages. And it might have been better to have not had open borders with Western Europe, right? You might have wanted to been protectionist almost, right? Assuming that this is the largest labor force we are ever going to have. Let's keep as much of it. Let's get their investment. Let's trade freely in terms of goods. But perhaps let's not rush into the free movement of peoples, because again, for a country like Romania, Bulgaria, that might just be demographic suicide.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only at babbel.com/Torenberg. That's babbel.com/Torenberg, spelled BABBEL.com/Torenberg. Rules and restrictions may apply. The tech world turns to the Brave browser for its unbeatable privacy protections. But did you know that Brave also has a private ad platform? Brave Ads offers first-party targeting, and it's been cookieless since day one, so you can relax while third-party tracking cookies disappear from the web. Today, millions of people turn to ad blockers to avoid being tracked and pestered online. But Brave's new ad model aligns incentives for users and advertisers. Users earn rewards for viewing ads, which they can save, spend, or pass along to their favorite creators. And advertisers score points for respecting user privacy, generating ROI without invasive tracking. So whether it's high-impact announcements on the new tab page or keyword-targeted ads in Brave Search offers diverse, private, future-proof ad formats for all your business goals. Join the future of advertising at brave.com/ads. Mention Turpentine to get 25% off your first campaign.
I think it's worth also noting the deep political economy differences between Western and Eastern Europe that lead to a certain extent to Eastern Europe being on net a better place to do business. Almost all Eastern European countries experienced a severe shock in the early 1990s. Soviet occupation ended, the Soviet Union collapsed. Also, similarly, Yugoslavia collapsed. A lot of state apparatuses were purged, just as we discussed in the challenges of small states. Places like Estonia would often fire anyone who is complicit with the old regime, with good reason. And as a result, a lot of the time, they didn't hire back quite as many bureaucrats. A lot of these states got to press the reset button. And in some places, this resulted in a kind of Russian or Ukrainian style, oligarchical, very corrupt state where they're like people with government ties, essentially. Everything is redistributed to them. It's very inefficient economically. There's a lot of rent this elite extracts. They use the rent to entrench themselves in power. The system, is on a trend line between autocracy and democracy. And let's say in the EU, most of the countries that have this problem are more on the democracy side. And outside of the EU, let's say most of them are closer to the autocracy side. That happens in some states, but in places like Estonia, Poland, you actually had a privatization that succeeded in creating a middle-class society. Small businesses were formed at a truly massive scale where the old inefficient state businesses went out of business. And there was even intentional ideological push against having large businesses. If you think about it from the perspective of trying to fortify your society against socialism, in a way, big business is not actually your friend. As soon as there is a national champion, the most competent thing to do is have a public-private partnership. The national champion can basically lobby the government, right? A large company, big business is decentralization of the economy. The economy is centralized. Therefore, the economy is easy to nationalize. Now, nationalization might wreck the company or it might not wreck the company. But either way, the temptation is there. It is very easy to nationalize. It is very difficult and at times bloody to nationalize lots and lots of small businesses, right? So it's actually politically super difficult. Even if you're, as serious about nationalizing everything as the Soviet Union, you're going to have like massive upheaval, unrest. You're going to have to resort to very harsh measures. To give an example, it's the expropriation of the kulaks, right? Like we remember that as like Soviet brutality, but really we should understand that it was actually kind of difficult for the Soviet state to do it. That's why they were so brutal. It was actually kind of hard to nationalize that. Meanwhile, like, a steel works or a shipyard in Leningrad, that's easy to take. You kind of, you show up, you arrest the CEO or you arrest the owner and you install one of your party guys as the CEO. And, for most of the workers in the factory, they don't care as long as their salary is still paid. So they're not going to resist, right? It's much easier to nationalize large central businesses. Now, large central businesses do have other benefits that we've discussed in some previous episodes. I used example like South Korea Samsung. And I do think that to be a very high income economy, you do need big business. However, if you're a former Soviet dissident and it's, 1991, 1990, it's like the Czech Republic, Poland, Estonia, your first priority is to make sure these assholes never climb back to power, right? And also, it's possible to reform a big, already broken company into a big functional company. But honestly, you have to be like Elon Musk at Twitter. You'd have to fire 80% of the people. So you're paying 80% of the political cost in the general election of just shutting down the company anyway, and you're risking it falling into the hands of an oligarch. Might be a better idea to just scrap it, right? So that's what I think Poland did to a great extent. And as a result, the number of small business owners is truly huge. And as a result, Polish politics are also, very, very petit bourgeois, right? There's a political party in Poland called the Party of Drivers. It's a political movement. They didn't win any seats at the latest election, but it basically fights for the right, and I quote, fighting for the rights of drivers and haulers. So, okay. Clearly there are lots of truck owners. Clearly there are lots of like shipping and logistics businesses. They built a lot of roads. Sure, that's state investment. And clearly a lot of people are commuting to work in Poland. There's a boom in basically the construction of suburb style houses. In a way, Poland has successfully and quite intentionally transitioned to the kind of society the United States saw itself as in the 1950s and 1980s. And this is matched with this strange fusion of basically religious conservatism with kind of libertarian political intuitions, right? And, this is the recreation kind of American fusionism, but in a Polish context. And many of the people there are, in fact, reading sort of American and British conservative thinkers. Many of them would view Thatcher and Reagan as kind of like the epitome of the West. There is, on the other hand, the opposed tendency, right? I think that in the Polish context, their university systems have become more and more important for hiring. This is something that is generally worse in Europe. The personal economic fallout of the university system is less bad for Europeans than Americans because the losses of having to put half of your population through college, which in my opinion is a zero-sum exercise of limited utility to society, the losses of that are not personalized on the people who attempt a college degree. They are mostly paid by society at large, and the costs have been rising relatively slowly, partially because the state is stingy and does not want to spend that much on universities directly. And as a result, European universities, like the delta of administrative costs between, say, American universities and European universities is quite shocking, like if you plot it on a graph. Still, credentialism runs rampant, and people respect education because until very recently in Eastern Europe, having a PhD meant you were a pretty smart guy or gal. In America, that's, I think it's almost no longer the case. I think you could definitely have very mediocre PhD holders by this point, but it's certainly the case that a PhD today is much less impressive and signals lower intellectual ability on average than a PhD 50 years ago. There's psychometric data on this, including some studies that would go as far as to say that apparently the current average IQ of bachelor's degree graduates in the United States is 100.2. For a reminder, the average is 100.0. So in other words, a completely inconsequential difference, right? All it proves or signals is that you're probably not below average. So of course we have to start looking for other indicators like which school did you go to, et cetera, instead of just whether one has a degree. So degrees are a little bit like paper currency, right? You print a lot of it, it gets devalued, except in the process of printing them, you've wasted 4 to 8 years of the life of your youngest people in a society that has a young people shortage to begin with. So anyway, disaster at every level, and we could discuss the university and its consequences. Maybe we can have an episode titled, the university system and the consequences for the human race. Let's do that maybe. Have a spicy one. But still, the universities are producing in Poland the exact same social effects in the large cities. Poland now has a rural-urban divide. Sounds familiar?
Yeah.
Make 1950s America or 1980s America, get 1990s America problems, like just down the line. Politically, the cities are reliably voting for essentially progressive values, for redistribution. In some ways, this is still conservative by Western standards, but the old stereotype of Eastern European social conservatism or Eastern European ultranationalism has dissolved. From the right, it's dissolving through a shift to more libertarian economics. Now, there are counterexamples, which we could talk about, places like, say, Hungary, right? And places that are more complicated, such as, ironically, Estonia. I think in Estonia, what could be termed progressive nationalism is very strong because the view is that preserving the Estonian language and in a way assimilating and integrating the Russian minority is an existential question. So there's some ways in which I would say compare Estonia or the Baltics to say like an Israel or a Taiwan, where you might see like a form of civic or linguistic or cultural nationalism or even ethno-nationalism be paired up with relatively high taxes or a welfare state or whatever. Poland is, I feel, moving towards the Anglosphere political combination where you have, conservatism, nominal nationalism, but tempered by business interests. So you get kind of a fusionism of Christian values and libertarian economics. And then Hungary and others have like different models, but still this distinction between Western and Eastern Europe, where Eastern Europeans, like people might colloquially say that they're based, right? I think that's a generational effect of the 1990s, and it's now slowly wearing off. Like the delta in the lived experience of Gen Z in Eastern Europe versus Western Europe is shrinking, right? And the worldview difference is shrinking as well. Any place that is an EU member and has access to the Anglosphere's internet, or, China's internet, anywhere where TikTok is not banned and YouTube videos can be watched, I think the generational difference has shrunk immensely. There was a generational effect in the 1990s because the mainstream ideology of all of those societies was profoundly disproved. You stopped believing communist propaganda. You didn't immediately start believing other things. Sometimes you believed 19th century propaganda about your nation and you reverted to like romantic liberal nationalism, or you believed and sought out for intellectual self-edification something like, Milton or Hayek, just because you hated communism that much. Also, you found the Western European attitudes on like gender to be profoundly unrealistic. It's like not that women should stay home. Like, obviously, your wife has to go to the factory. She has to work. But it's silly to pretend men are not men and women are not women, and she should still do the dishes. Like, that's kind of the Eastern European perspective, right? It's like that there was this view that the gender norms and the gender polarity is there, and it's not even tied to the economics very much. For example, a lot of people might be surprised to hear that even in modern Germany, the number of stay-at-home mothers and stay-at-home wives is far higher than any Eastern European country. So if you wanted to, if you used sort of an American perspective on what is the conservative lifestyle, which is actually the 1950s relatively affluent suburban lifestyle, Germany is more conservative than, say, Poland, where the number of PhDs per capita in STEM, for example, for women is much, much higher than, let's say, Norway, which is like a truly rich country, right? Norway is a place that I would argue is richer per capita than America, bolstered by both normal Scandinavian development and their vast oil reserves, which they feel very guilty about, but they assuage with, buying green cars. Like when you go to Oslo, half of the cars are the most expensive Teslas they can buy. I'm sure if someone develops a new luxury electric brand that's any good, we'll see it on the streets of Oslo too. So that's an example. Still, the point being, in a lot of Scandinavia, you actually have more gender stereotypes as to which majors men and women pick. And in Eastern Europe, you have a lot of female engineers, a lot of female mathematicians, and so on. And that's partially also a legacy of this different value system. I think this is being eroded, and there's data to show that as this old system is eroded, which was, in a way embraced gender dimorphism, like embraced men and women's different roles, different expectations, but in other ways, like asserted that women must be part of the economy and that women must achieve education and that women should be pursuing mathematics and the hard sciences, right? That is being eroded slowly and replaced, where among younger generations of women in Eastern Europe, it's, chemistry, physics, computer science. These are the things that are now less popular. And communications degrees or language degrees or administrative degrees are more popular. So we see a version of the phenomena that has internationally been described as the gender paradox, which is this sort of, spicy question of, by some measures, why does Iran have more female engineers than Sweden, right? And one answer is that if given choice, and if you are not poor, you will pick what you want to pick, not what's best earning. So in a way, all affluent societies to some extent suffer from lower economic efficiency of talent distribution, where people simply don't value not being poor enough to go against what is most productive, to go against their personal inclinations, right? They'll first try to get themselves educated in what seems coolest. And sometimes, like in tech, fortunately, that matches up with what's well remunerated. And other times, literature, it's not so well remunerated. So you have to go for plan B, right? I think because of that, in places like Iran, also there's another factor. So I'm just going to say one more thing about Iran before I go back to my broader point about the changing gender values in Eastern Europe. In Iran also, if you're an ambitious young man and you want to have the highest status possible and you're very intelligent, you're not going to go study mathematics, okay? You're going to go study the Quran. You're going to make Ayatollah. Making Ayatollah in Iran is like making partner in a law firm. Yeah. And it's a legal profession too, right? Like religious law is law there. So, and if you're a woman, well, you're never going to make Ayatollah. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. So you might as well go study math, right? And that's why we might have Persian fields medalists, female fields medalists. I'm simplifying, but that's like a complicating factor on the pure wealth, bringing out people's individual preferences because they're no longer fear abject poverty. So that's right. A complicating factor on that model. And to go back to Eastern Europe and some of these education figures and some of these changes, I think that paradoxically, the Westernization of Northern Eastern Europe is happening at a decent pace. Estonia is converging essentially with Scandinavian norms. The other Baltic countries want to say that they're going the same way as Estonia, but realistically, I think they will go the same way as Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, which I think will converge with sort of, let's call them vaguely like a sort of liberal / libertarian value mix, where there will be people who favor progressive social reform, who favor, I don't know, things like abolishing gender to prove our power over the universe, versus people who want to abolish the state to prove the power of the economy, like that sort of thing at the extremes. And I think Southern Eastern Europe, it's going to actually just converge to Southern Europe. It's going to be, these places are going to feel like Greece. They're going to feel like Portugal. And some of them are also going to get beautiful tourism, right? Croatia and Montenegro currently, like you go to any Instagram influencer's site, it's now common to take like a tour on the Adriatic coast on a boat and stop by those beautiful islands, right? It'll be romanticized. There'll be some tourist income, but it won't be enough to make these countries truly rich. I expect eventually similar things will happen in Bulgaria. Romania will be trickier. I think because while they do have natural beauty, it's much harder to market mountains and forests. You can market mountains and forests, but you have to already be sort of rich. Beaches and coasts, well, those are easy to market no matter how impoverished your country is. It's easy to want to bring people out into the sun and into the sea. So the convergence with Mediterranean will be, that's the future of Croatia. That's the future of Montenegro. That's probably the future of Bulgaria. And then for the other countries, it's going to be a bit tougher, and they're going to persist in this sort of like low income, old demographics. If they join the EU, they might just be significantly depopulated too, kind of hinterlands, right? I have a lot of opinions. I'm originally from Slovenia, and I've also done many case studies.
I'm tempted to go into the immigration stuff, but I also,
we can do a full episode on that, to be honest.
We should do that. I guess one question I have is like, you mentioned the 1950s, make way for the 90s. And in some ways in the US, at least, the 90s makes way for the 2010s.
2000s.
Yeah, exactly.
Or 2020s, right? Makes way for, encampments, mass protests, and riots.
Yeah, I guess, do you think that there's a similar progression here that is slated to happen? Like, do you see this, what happened in the US as like a template that will also happen elsewhere? Or that they will...
I think it will happen in Poland. Now, of course, if the US changes direction fast enough, Eastern Europe greatly admires Americans. Even the left-wing people who think they don't admire Americans actually really, when people say, oh, Europe's a backwater, people in Western Europe protest and people in Eastern Europe are like, so true, right? Like that's kind of the difference in attitude. And Eastern Europe also still looks up to Germany because Germany's still richer. But I think America has been overtaking Germany. And in Poland, of course, they have a historic reason to be anti-German. So America is like the most natural, wealthy country to idolize. So the perception of German wealth is tempered by the historical experience and also tempered by this genuine admiration for the US as an alternative to both Russia and Germany, right? Which was sort of Poland's historic problem, being between those two cultural centers and powers. I think it will happen, and that's why I brought up the universities. Eastern European universities mostly follow Anglosphere ideological trends. Eastern European social media mostly follows Western ideological trends. So even if it's delivered through TikTok, they follow Western TikTokers. They don't follow Chinese TikTokers, right? And kids, Gen Alpha, they watch Mr. Beast in Europe, Eastern Europe. They watch Mr. Beast in English as well. So a factor here is that Eastern Europe language proficiency English language proficiency is going up beyond what you actually see in Italy and France. In Italy, France, and Germany, well, Germany is different. Germany has high English proficiency. But in Italy and France, the market is large enough, for example, to do things like dub films. In small countries like Slovenia or Lithuania, all the movies are going to be in English with subtitles in Lithuanian or Slovenian. Poland can sort of afford some voice acting and voiceovers and so on, but still, English is considered the default language of commerce, right? So English proficiency is very high. A lot has been invested into English education, and these are still fairly functional education systems. And in fact, they've been upgraded and the budgets are high, but the public school systems are relatively efficient. And that's another factor of why we should model Eastern Europe. Perhaps one quip I could put it to explain it to the American context. For much of Eastern Europe, imagine like Texas is too much, but let's call it Arizonan social values, and then overlaid over that a Californian education system with the like sort of ideological content, like relatively strong teachers unions, for example, are also a feature of these societies, right? And there's a lot of pride and professionalism there. And because of this self-conscious minority view, I think that we will see rapid assimilation to, not just on the right, where, people caring about gun rights is completely ahistorical for Eastern Europe. There were no gun rights. It's clear imitation of American conservatism. So that's happening on the right. On the left, you will see imitation of whatever is popular in San Francisco. And to a great extent, we see this in some other poor European countries. Like if you went to the University of Lisbon in Portugal and talked to the students there, it would feel like a UC Berkeley campus. Like they would care about Black Lives Matter, for example, at the same time American students cared about it. Are there that many Black people in Lisbon? Is the police shooting them? No, not really. Not really. I mean, maybe they will be, but that's not the point, right? The point is the moral fashion. And, if I go back to Ljubljana, I feel very much at home. I feel Ljubljana is caught up to San Francisco. And I'm not personally that socially conservative. So that's to some extent I am in some values, but not in others. But still, it's objectively a sociological fact that I see the trans flag, not the traditional gay flag in Ljubljana. So the old gay flag, that one's bad. You need to have the new one, right? Everyone in San Francisco is kind of special. You can still fly the gay flag as a historic one, but it's been superseded everyone else, right? It might be seen as an anti-trans thing. But if I went to Poland, I think most of the flags, even among the progressives, would still be the classic rainbow flag. So they're not trying to be weird. They're not trying to be contrarian. They are just out of touch and behind the latest moral fashion in their tribe. But they are part of the global blue tribe. So I think that there is much as in the United States now, you will have people in blue states kind of identifying with weird Southern redneck stereotypes, and people in red states identifying with basically what they perceive to be as blue coastal. I think the American red-blue divide is becoming pan-Western. For countries with a deeper political tradition and weirder, more idiosyncratic politics like France or Britain, this assimilation to American political and ideological norms and polarization is taking longer. It's slower, but for places like Eastern Europe, where the previous political tradition was wiped clean, it is converging rapidly. So I think Eastern Europe will, thinking of Poland as the Texas of Europe might just actually start making more and more sense. I wouldn't even be shocked if they legalized fracking. I mean, to own the Russians, we of course have to have our own oil and gas. Let's check if there's shale anywhere here, right? Let's check if there's oil underwater. Let's build more oil pipelines. Let's not rely on the Germans. Let's build nuclear power plants. These are things that strike people as optimistic and positive. But then my pessimism is sort of the same pessimism I would, it's either I would describe it as an optimism to my Democratic Party friends, and I would describe it as pessimism to my Republican Party friends, which is that, if Texas or Poland wonderfully succeed at their pro-economic growth policies, the result will be 5 to 10 very large cities that come to demographically dominate the state. And those cities are going to have values closer to Berkeley. So Texas ultimately becomes Austin, and I think Poland ultimately becomes Warsaw and Krakow. And that actually means that Poland's probably going to end up being not too different from the Netherlands or Dublin in terms of its social values. So a prediction that I would make is that we will see a collapse in Polish Catholicism in terms of self-identification, where it's going to go down very rapidly, maybe to as little as 20 or 30%, following not just the Southern European and Irish pattern, but this common pattern of a rapidly modernizing society. Simultaneously, I predict among Polish conservatives, Protestantism will become surprisingly popular. I wouldn't be shocked if evangelicals literally succeeded in gaining a foothold in Poland, and American-style megachurches showing up. That Polish car drivers party, can't you just imagine them really enjoying a car-centric church service with a rock concert? Just imagine these guys, 50-year-old Gen X Polish guys, sort of anti-Russian. They hear an evangelical preacher. They show up. They're having a great time. They're slightly overweight. They'd love it. They think it's so much better than the quaint little churches. Now, this is not to deny that there is a harder and more self-aware Catholic community there. And I think they will continue to develop there. But I think the sort of moderate Catholics will vanish, and there will only be very traditional Catholics like you see in France and to a much lesser extent Spain. And the majority will either become secular, or if they want to do this sort of Sunday religion, they're going to possibly do things like become evangelical or become Mormon, right? Because that's sort of a viable lifestyle, right? It fulfills, it fits the package. So, and geographically, at the end of the day, Poland is a very flat country. So I think it will develop urban sprawl. That's going to happen. That will start to happen as soon as policing starts to fail in major Polish cities. For now, policing is still good, but under current Western values, policing is basically illegitimate. So you just have to accept harassment, first of women and then of everyone, on the streets of major cities, because to do otherwise is, fascist or something, which I don't think it is. But actually, once that happens, then suddenly there's a premium to leave the inner city. Right? In Slovenian or other European countries, mesto, the inner city, the center, is the good place, right? But that inverts itself as soon as you have bad policing, and especially if the demographics shift and, Poland, say, started accepting massive amounts of refugees. I think, all the super right-wing critiques of, this is going to result in a crime spike. Well, that's an empirical reality. No matter how much the UK and German governments might tamper down on free speech, the statistics and anecdotal evidence speaks for itself. So really, Poland will eventually import the same sort of problem. But even if it doesn't, they will start to see drug addiction rise. Another prediction is that in Eastern Europe, drug use was very, very low. But there are very few libertarian arguments. They're good traditionalist or conservative arguments against taking drugs or tolerating drugs in your social circle. But there are a few libertarian arguments for telling someone what they can't put in their body. So ultimately, I think in Eastern Europe, drug use will be decriminalized, and it will start slowly converging with American rates of drug use, which will be fine for most of the drugs, or mostly fine, no worse than smoking. But for a small number of them, Well, you could have an opioid epidemic or fentanyl. And then it doesn't matter what your demographics are, you will have wandering zombies in the center of your city. And then suddenly the city is not a pleasant place to live, right? Even if the violent crime is not great. So that will drive suburbanization, in addition to the much more normal consumerist perspective of, hey, I want a house with a pool, right? Eastern Europeans still want their house with a pool. They still want their house with AC. They're excited by new things. They love them. If you look at their kitchens, everything has to be sparkling and modern. They like it. They enjoy it. And they're only frustrated when the job market doesn't match that or doesn't provide that.
What have we not covered that you think is important?
Well, what we've not covered is that I think the open question remains whether Eastern Europe will remain a corporate outpost of Germany or whether it will develop its own large corporations. I described the reasons why in the 1990s they weren't trying to favor large companies. But I think in places like Poland, if they develop a domestic defense industry, a domestic energy industry, either through nuclear power plants or enhanced mining, let's call it, and just through the normal process of competition, where economies of scale are beautiful and do super well, and improve economics, we might actually see a very strong economy. So Poland especially has more scale than any of those countries. So if Poland got a few industrial giants, a few technological giants, which might happen, by the way, video game studios, for example, often come from Eastern Europe and often have, very successful video games. I think the Witcher video game series was significantly developed by the Polish studios or Polish offices. So these are very well remunerated things. There could be a tech industry there even one day. I think that the lines will cross and Poland will one day, before the century is over, be richer per capita than Germany. Mostly because Germany is ahead of the curve on decline and will need decades to undo the mistakes of their energy transition. And Poland's doing everything right to have cheap energy 20 years from now. So it's not certain, but it's more probable than not that Poland will be much richer. And it's probable, but not certain, that Poland will develop its own defense industry. And then we will see whether it will be as successful as, say, Sweden's defense industry, where they even managed to sell weapons to the Pentagon, right? Which is where the real money is if you want to be selling weapons, right? Selling weapons to Iran is for losers. Selling weapons to the Pentagon is lucrative, right? To Iran, you give 2 missiles, you make $1,000 per missile. The missiles have to work. The Pentagon, you give them 2 missiles, they cost $1 million. They don't even have to work. So it's really just the margins are much better. But the other one is, I think in terms of foreign policy, I expect Northern Eastern Europe to be firmly in the American camp, as long as the Americans are anti-Russian. And I think that also Southern Europe is more mixed. Southern Eastern Europe, the Balkans are more mixed. You obviously have countries that are pro-Russian there. They will likely stay pro-Russian, such as Serbia, which is kind of economically and politically isolated and surrounded by NATO states and surrounded by EU states and has no prospect to join either in the near future. Romania, Bulgaria, you could see unusual politics in Romania, where especially the question of possible unification with Moldova and possibly Russian intervention in Moldova to favor the small separatist Republic of Transnistria, where currently there are already Russian troops. A lot of people don't know there are currently Russian troops in Moldova, and Moldova is on the other side of Ukraine, right? So you have Russians in Crimea advancing and have sort of stabilized on a river border. If ever they were to go all the way to Odessa, I would not be shocked for a war in Moldova where the small breakaway statelet that's not recognized just actually tries to join Russia. And that would quickly involve Moldova and would immediately involve Romania and might actually also flip Hungary, where Hungary currently tries to split the difference between Russia, and the United States, always for its own benefit. So the geopolitics of Eastern Europe are tied to the future of Russo-American relations, would be one way to put it. And the worse the security situation is of Eastern Europe, the likelier it is that places like Poland will produce new defense giants and will start producing high-tech weaponry.
Yeah. Well, Samo, this is great. We set up a couple conversations for the future. One is on immigration and another on the university system, among other topics. But as always, a great conversation. And until next week.
Yeah, great chatting, Erik.
Thanks for listening to Live Players. Please subscribe, leave a review, and check out Samo's excellent newsletter, The Bismarck Brief, for more rigorous analysis of key individuals, institutions, or industries. Live Players is a production of Turpentine, the podcast network behind Econ 102 with Noah Smith and Moment of Zen. Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at eric@turpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.